Welcome to the Women in AI Research podcast, the show about remarkable contributions of female AI researchers around the globe. I'm your host, Jekaterina, and I'm sharing the mic today with my co-host, Malikeh. Are you a native English speaker from North America? If, like me, you're not, there is a good chance that AI you use every day doesn't quite understand you, your language, or your culture.
Great. Let's shift to vision language models. These models need to understand both images and text from different cultures. What makes a studying cultural bias in VLMs in particular different from studying text-only models, and what drew you to work on this problem?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of similarities between cultural biases in LLMs versus VLMs. I think just like, LLMs are mostly trained on English text from US-based users, so do VLMs are mostly trained on images from Western cultures. But I think maybe one of the difficulties with VLMs is that one of the objectives when training a VLM is to align the visual modality with the language modality. And so they are trained on tasks such as like image captioning that can strengthen the association between a word like house and the image of a house. And when we have and then like a concept like house looks different in different cultures. But when we have mostly images from Western cultures, then it has this like high association by the visual representation of a house in Western countries than like with other cultures. And the more visually different they are, the I guess the less likely it is to associate it with the representation of other cultures.
I see. And you have that paper that's titled From Local Concepts to Universals, where you have created the benchmark with data from 50 different countries. So can you walk us through this benchmark and how your two main tasks, where one is retrieval across universals and another is cultural visual grounding, how those two help understand cultural biases that were not measured before?
Yeah, so we deliberately focused on two common and very basic vision and language tasks, and we wanted to test how well models do on these tasks when they involve knowledge about different cultures. So the first one, the retrieval across universals. So this is basically image retrieval. So you have in the original task of like retrieval, you have a textual query like breakfast or house. And then you want to return relevant images from the collection of images that correspond to that concept. And we focused on universal concepts that have different representations across different cultures. And then we looked both at the ranking accuracy, basically verifying that if we say breakfast, then all the images that are retrieved are indeed like of breakfast items. But we also looked at the diversity of the cultures in the top 10 retrieved images. So there's just like making sure that it's not only like retrieving images from the US, for example. For the second task, and for this one, for image retrieval, we had 50 countries. That one was automatically created with cultural knowledge from an existing resource called Candle, which is like text only, and by scraping images from Google Images. For the second task, the visual grounding, we actually only had 15 countries because for that one we needed to get annotations. And so in this task, in visual grounding, usually you have an image and you have a textual query and you need to draw a bounding box around the corresponding object in the image. And in our case, we focused on culture-specific images and concepts that are like specific to that culture. So for example, we had like a molinillo, hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, which is a Mexican whisk. And yeah, and so I think like what we did differently was both like looking at this like cultural diversity of the answers in the image retrieval, and also we had tested a lot more countries than in previous work that usually only covered like 5-7 cultures.
Yeah, even 15 countries is already quite a quite quite a diversity, I'd say.
Yeah.
I totally agree. And you found something really interesting, as you also said, even when VLMs find seemingly diverse images, they often contain Western elements like eggs for breakfast and white dresses at weddings. What does this tell us about how these models learn about different cultures?
Yeah, I think it's exactly because of that problem, or like just the way that they're trained to align the visual and text modalities. And so like if most of the images in these models training data are from Western cultures, then they form this strong association between a word like breakfast and
Yeah.
the breakfast images from the West that tend to contain elements like eggs.
Yeah.
And then so even when they surface the on the surface, like they retrieve images from diverse cultures, there are still those images that are visually aligned with the Western cultures. And we also realized something. So when we had this like metric that we suggested there that was looking at geographical diversity, but we also realized that it's not perfect because there's like it's not perfectly aligned with cultural diversity, because like if it retrieves images from like the US and Australia, then it's geographically diverse. But then these are still like two English speaking countries that are like, they have a lot of similarities. They're more different than like, for example, India or I don't know, like Nigeria, for example.
Yeah, and it's also that your cultural visual grounding task showed a big performance difference between culturally different regions. So, for example, models do much better on North American images versus, let's say, East Asian or Southeast Asian. I wonder, what is your perspective on the strength of vision language models in how they deal with cultural diversity? And also, do you see differences between VLMs, vision language models, and LLMs in this aspect?
Yeah, I think that LLMs are actually better at that. I think that LLMs might be able to provide definitions for concepts that VLMs can't ground. I don't have any specific example, but I think that, for example, if your goal was like to get better performance on this benchmark, for example, one thing that you can do is you can use you can use an LLM to maybe like describe how something looks and then provide that to the VLM. I think that like visual association is weaker, but I also think that this benchmark, it actually tests something that is relatively like simpler than other areas of like cultural competence in AI, because it's testing models on their familiarity with the concepts. And uh, that's something that can be fixed. So like if, as long as you have the data to train it on, like if, for example, if it doesn't know what a molinillo is, if you have the data to train it on and show it a few pictures and say, this is a molinillo, it's going to learn that. It's less complicated than when you ask it, for example, to like draw on like specific cultural norms when making decisions. This is all about just knowing about something. And so I think like our results were like interesting from the perspective that we were able to show that, oh, this should be pretty basic and it doesn't know that. But the good news is I think it's relatively easy to solve that. Of course, it's more complicated if you want to teach the model about like low resource cultures where this data is not available, like, like smaller communities, like indigenous cultures that maybe you don't actually have images of the different concepts or enough like text to train it on either. But in general, if you have the data, it's like the simpler thing to address.
Interesting.
Yeah, I agree. Very interesting points. You created a new diversity outcome metric alongside traditional accuracy measures to capture cultural diversity in image retrieval. Can you first explain what this metric is, and then why did you need this new way of measuring performance?
Yeah. So for the ranking task, the retrieval task, usually you use ranking methods like precision at K, or the K retrieved images, or accuracy at K. And you basically want to know that if you ask it to retrieve images of breakfast, for example, you want to make sure that like the top K images indeed correspond to breakfast images. What we wanted to also quantify is how many different countries or regions these images are coming from. Because if you can get 100% accuracy by retrieving only images of breakfast from the US, or you can retrieve images across cultures with 0% accuracy, or like close to 0% accuracy, which is none of these alone is enough. And so we proposed this metric with two different variations, diversity across countries or diversity across regions. Because, like, for example, if it retrieves images from Canada and the US, then it's a little bit more diverse, but it's still just North America. And so it was doing a little bit better on like regional diversity, I believe, but then like a bit worse on country level diversity. But with that said, this metric still is like an underestimate of the actual diversity of the model, because as I mentioned earlier, models could still like identify images that have Western elements, even if they're coming from different cultures. So the eggs in the breakfast example was one of these. The other one was a white wedding dress, I think, in some of the models. That is something that comes from different cultures, but is also associated like with Western countries. And also because the geographic diversity is just a proxy for cultural diversity. So both in the sense of the example that I gave earlier of like US versus Australia, they're very like geographically distant, but the cultures are, they're not the same, but they have, or like maybe if you take something like maybe like UK and Australia, or the cultures are like somewhat similar in a way, but they are very geographically distant. And at the same time, you can look at the opposite problem. Like we didn't test that specifically, but if we were to test like, smaller communities, like indigenous communities within countries like the US or Canada, then the geographic diversity would be smaller. But if it's able to retrieve images from both, then that's actually a good signal. So it's still just a proxy. So I do urge people to come up with better metrics, but we definitely need to test some type of diversity.
That's very interesting. And also, I liked a lot that you when you mentioned that VLMs are actually better better than LLMs in some aspects of when handling cultural biases. So I wonder how much of that comes from the fact that it's a different modality. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that it's also like the different ways that we use them. So I think that yeah, I think that when you get like when you use a VLM and you ask it, for example, so that's not something that we tested, but there was a different paper. Can't remember right now which group it was coming from, but there was a paper like about a year or a couple of years ago that was looking at image generation models for a very similar like phenomenon where you give it a universal concept like house, and then like it generates an image and it looks like a house in the US. Or like even a stronger result that they had in their paper was if you tell it to generate an image of a flag, and it generates the flag of the US. And so it's definitely biased, but it's also very easy to spot that bias because it's
Right.
like you see this immediately, like visually. On the other hand, in LLMs, it's a little bit more subtle sometimes. Like if it's telling me, if it's giving me, or like if it's giving someone a recommendation to wear a bow tie for a wedding, it's harder to trace that, oh, it's doing that because it was mostly trained on data from the US and this is how they dress up for weddings. So I think it's just a bit more subtle, and it's harder to show that in LLMs.
Right. Right. Interesting. Thanks for sharing those insights. Let's speak a little bit about benchmarks right now. And good benchmarks, they are essential in many aspects of NLP in general, and also for measuring cultural bias in AI systems and LLMs. From your experience creating benchmarks, what makes a cultural bias benchmark effective? And what problems do you see with the current evaluation methods?
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, one thing that is desired is to have like a good coverage of countries. But I also think that benchmarks that focus on even just one country, they're also very valuable. And often they actually are able to go like more in depth into like, or like to uh, actually, so I would say actually the most important thing is for me to have some people from those respective cultures involved in the data collection. So that's something that we did with Global RG for the visual grounding task. We hired people from all these different countries, um, and it's hard to do that, but I think it's also important. And so, yeah, if you usually there's a trade-off between how many countries or cultures you can cover versus like the reliability, like how reliable this data is and how or like being able to validate it with people from those respective cultures. I would also say that there's like along the same line, there's a trend of like automating the uh, every step of the process in NLP right now, from like the data creation for the benchmarks through the model. I mean, I guess modeling, that's fine, to the evaluation, to like delegate that to language models. And I think we do run the risk here of like not like kind of missing that like bias, because I don't know, if you collect the data from just from a language model, you don't have people from those cultures involved. You have the bias already in the benchmark, and then you use a language model to evaluate it. So I think definitely like in general in NLP, but maybe even more specifically when you're looking at something like culture, you need to have people involved in the data collection and in the evaluation. So I would say that's probably the most important thing. And if it means that we can only collect like smaller benchmarks and like focus on a smaller number of cultures, then that's okay, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think in terms of the benchmarks, it's not that much about scaling. We do not need those huge data sets to evaluation sets to just assess the models. It's enough to be comprehensive and properly designed, and that's it. It's not
Yeah.
that. Yeah, how to solve the problems if they are there? That's a different question, but
That's a hard one. Like I think a lot of the times like we end up creating benchmarks that are, that they still suffer from these problems because I mean it's hard to collect anything from completely from scratch, but then if you rely on any kind of existing data, you can be sure that models were trained on that already. So like for example, for global RG, we scraped images from Google and we used sentences from the Kendall data set. So those were all trained too, and used to train like VLMs and LLMs. We were able to like create questions that were like, or like to test it in a way that was still non-trivial for the model, but it's tricky sometimes to, even if there is a cultural bias, like just to be able to show that with a benchmark is tricky to show that.
Yeah, interesting. I had a question regarding this benchmark development and data development in particular. Right now, many of the like AI development like companies are based in like developed kind of countries, and the contributors are sometimes very familiar with the local culture of these limited number of countries. Do you think if decentralization of model development or data annotation would help, or even with this ecosystem, we can handle that? Because like me, like I immigrated a couple of years ago, and I am even non-familiar with many of the local cultures in my home country. So I wonder, what is the approach to do that? Because many of these cultural nuances are not available on the net. And speaking of the fixes, do you think decentralizing somehow this access to at least data annotation would help, or these LLMs, we can find some ways to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much an open research problem. I don't know what the solution is. I think that definitely like having more people involved in the development of the models helps. So, for example, if you want it to be like applicable for people from different cultures, then you definitely want to involve people from these cultures. But I also agree that culture is kind of like complicated that way, that like we're not like our identities are like a little bit more complicated than that. Like you were born somewhere and then you move somewhere else sometimes, and you have this mixed identity. And I also like identify with what you said, because I also feel like there's a lot of things in my home country that I don't know anymore. On the other hand, I'm not like, I still find a lot of things that I don't know, like in Canada, like where I live right now. Um, and so it's a lot more complicated than that. And I think also, like, if you're thinking about the solution, and that's actually something that I struggle with, because every time I talk to people that work on this area of research, like, we're still pretty much still in the first stage of just showing the problem, but there's not a lot of work on like solving that problem, and it's not clear what is the way to solve that. So one way in which I don't think would be right is like completely personalizing the answers. So saying like, oh, you come from country X, then I'm going to like talk to you in a way that like completely aligns with your culture, because it's ignoring the fact that people have like more like complex identities, and be sometimes overcorrecting. So for example, if my native language is Hebrew and I say the word afternoon, do I want it to like, mediate and translate it to someone as like 4 p.m.? But what if I'm already like accustomed to using it the North American way, and like I actually meant it as like native English speakers use it? So you have this problem of like overcorrecting. You don't want to make too many assumptions either. And then the last one is like, you don't want to create these like echo chambers where everybody just hears whatever they want to hear, and they never get exposed to the other opinions. So, I mean, beyond having a lot of people involved in that, I don't know about, I really don't know what the solution should be. Like another like direction could be, instead of having the language model always like perfectly answer that, having something like a more like UI based solution where you could like, explore different answers that maybe align with different cultures, or like, just be able to say like, oh, like it depends on like, clarifying the context to better tailor the answers. Um, but yeah, I don't think there's any magic bullet right now.
So, your recent work introduces a cultural bench, which uses a cultural teaming approach where humans and AI work together to create questions. Can you explain how this method works and why you chose this collaborative approach for building a benchmark that covers 45 regions, including places like Bangladesh and Zimbabwe?
Yeah, so the idea here was kind of like a compromise between like having the benchmark completely collected by people versus completely generated by models. So like you take that knowledge from people, and like having the model like help them like phrase it into like questions that are challenging, and do kind of like an iterative process until you get this like challenging benchmark that covers multiple different cultures.
I wonder, across all your research on LLMs, VLMs, and cultural benchmarking, you keep finding evidence that Western cultures dominate while non-Western perspectives are underrepresented. Looking at your findings together, what do you think causes these biases, and what changes do you see as most important for future AI development?
So I think probably one of like the main causes of these biases is just the availability and the proportion of the data. So I think because of our paradigm right now in generative AI, or in machine learning in general, where like you need a lot of data to train models, then for the pre-training step, for example, if you're focusing on language models, the developers of these models, they take as much data as they can get, and so it's disproportionately going to be in English. So we don't know, because these like recent models are proprietary, we don't know exactly what they're trained on. But if you look at models that are open source, like Llama 2, in their paper, they basically say that the corpus they trained it on was 90% in English. So it's like 90%. It's like, it's really skewed. And then there's like nobody would take the solution of like, oh, let's like balance the data and like sample it such that we have like equal amounts of data from different languages, because you need as much data as you can get to make these models work well. If you downsampled, you would get a model that is like, not even fluent in English. So there's definitely that problem of just the proportion of the data. And then beyond that, the secondary cause is all these like post-training stages. It's because the developer of these models, for the most part, I mean, there are some models that come from like China or other countries. But for the most part, the developers are mostly based in the US. And when they implement these like post-training guardrails, they do that from the perspective of their own culture. And they if they have like for the preference tuning, when they write the guidelines for the annotators, the guidelines come from what they consider morally acceptable. And beyond the fact that I find it very weird that a bunch of computer scientists are deciding on like what's like morally acceptable versus not. Just the fact that like it's mostly just like people coming from the US, probably also mostly men. Then it's concerning because you don't have everybody's voice. Like they're trying to instill human values into these models, but like what is human values? It's like very culture specific, and they turned out to be mostly like North American values. So again, I think the most important thing is like moving forward to just have diverse groups of individuals involved in the design and in the development of AI models. So both in terms of like diversity of expertise, so computer scientists, but also social scientists, legal experts, ethicists, and so on. But also like diversity in terms of gender, cultural background, and so on. Otherwise, you have this phenomenon of like these engineers saying, "Oh, it works for me," but not like until these tools are deployed, and often like in sensitive decision-making setups where it ends up discriminating against someone, and then you discover that actually there are problems in these tools. So yeah, just having a more diverse like set of people working on these tools is probably the best thing we can do right now. But also working on a different paradigm where maybe we can do something a little bit more sophisticated that doesn't rely on so much data, and so we kind of like decouple the data and like make it easier to train models that don't need a lot of data to work well for different cultures.
Yeah, all good suggestions. You have studied cultural bias through many different perspectives via analyzing Wikipedia, evaluating cultural knowledge, and testing vision language understanding. So, what directions are you most excited to explore next in your research?
Yeah, so I think I'm getting increasingly more drawn to working with people and studying how people actually interact with these technologies and how they can be improved. And it's a little bit harder to do than what we usually do in NLP, which is like develop benchmarks and test models. But like, for example, like some questions that I'm interested in is like, to what extent the output of LLMs are actually different for users from different cultures, or like, do people from non-Western cultures actually have misunderstandings when they're like interacting with the language models because of these cultural assumptions, or are like our communication styles changing and unifying over time? So I think this kind of research is it's harder to do. It's kind of like a different type of research than we usually do in NLP. But I also think it's important because it can inform both the development of new and more inclusive AI models, and also maybe like policy on AI regulation and so on. So yeah, I haven't started doing anything exactly like that, but I think that's a very interesting direction.
Best of luck with that.
Thank you.
And thank you to our listeners as well for tuning into the Women in AI Research. And we'll see you in 3 weeks. Bye.